Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to this final episode of the Down to Earth series of talks on Islamic concepts, where today we will talk about the balance, keeping the balance. Allah has described Muslims as a balanced community. A community that does not go into either extreme but steers a middle path. And obviously that means already that extremist ideologies, the kind of ideology that culminated in excesses like ISIS and so on, has no part in Islam. No matter how many black banners with the Kalima they wave, there's nothing Islamic about it because it's an extremist approach. And extremism has no place in Islam because Allah has described us as a balanced community, a community of the middle way. That's very important to remember. Also, extremism or fanaticism are usually a sign of repressed doubt. It's people who are not sure of themselves, who cling on to something such that they need to pretend to be very sure and impose on others their narrow view because they can't handle any other alternatives, because it would throw them off balance, because they themselves are not grounded. And so they restrict their belief system to that very narrow definition, those few things that they can understand before it gets too complicated for them. Sound judgment, because balance also has to do with sound judgment. That's why you have the scales of justice, that imagery. Not just in Islam, but generally where justice is concerned. Sound judgment means weighing up the different views, the different options, the different evidence put forward, the different stories people tell, and then reaching a conclusion that is fair to all parties involved. If somebody, of course, evidently has done something wrong, it needs to be set right. Often disputes are not that clear. Likewise, Islamic fiqh questions aren't always that clear. There isn't always an absolute right and wrong. That is not a form of relativism. It just means that the answers, the solutions must be workable. They must take account of the specific individual situation. If somebody does something, that is not enough for a judge to know that this person did this thing, and therefore that is the punishment, for example. If a millionaire steals an item from a shop, that is very different from, let's say, a homeless, hungry person stealing a food item from a shop. In each case, they might have taken the same item without permission and therefore committed a violation of the rules. Yet, what made them do it, the motivation, the justification, the mitigating circumstances are entirely different. One did it out of some whatever greedy motive. The other did it out of necessity and hunger. So we always have to keep the wider picture and always listen to all sides. This is so important in Islamic jurisprudence, that we listen to each side. We cannot make a judgment without hearing both sides. So Allah has placed the balance. And He has placed the balance not just with regard to taking decisions in disputes or finding answers to questions of life and how to live it, But generally, he made everything balanced in this world which we inhabit. Everything has its opposite or its complementary other part to it. There is positive, negative, there is male and female. Everything has two sides to it. And between those two, one needs to find a balance. If there were only males and no females, or a surplus of females and no males, no, Allah has made it balanced. And in everything He has created an equilibrium. But then, through our actions, because we do not understand the perfect balance of the world around us, we tend to distort that balance. And Allah says that corruption becomes apparent on earth and on sea as a result of the deeds or the work of people. So it is us who upset the balance. It is us who overexploit one resource. It is us who, especially in these days of industrialization and urbanization, which causes a great amount of the problems we face. It is us who end up with mass production, mass consumption, mass depletion of resources, and thereby greatly upset the balance to the extent that now we are worried about the survival of the planet. Our task, that of humanity, and of course foremost of Muslims who should be leaders of humanity, not just follow somebody else's leads. Our task is to, like Prophet Shu'aib alayhi salam expressed it, he said, I only intend to improve things to the best of my ability. Ma uridu illa al-islah, mastata'at. To improve things, to reform things, to make things better, islah. As much as I can do. And this is a prophet of Allah. None of us has been tasked with setting the world right. None of us has been given the task of sorting out the big picture, because that is what Allah does. He governs all affairs. We've been tasked with, when we see something wrong, to set it right by either correcting it or speaking up against it, or, as the weakest form of our faith, at least not acquiescing into it, not accepting it as right, but resisting it in our hearts, so that when the opportunity arises that we can say something or do something, we will. That is our task, as much as we can, no more. If everybody rights their own affairs, the world will come to rights. If everybody ignores their own affairs because they've got their sights on, well, we must gain control of the government and then we must impose this and impose that, whereas at the same time their own family is in shatters, you know, it goes, it's breaking up, their own environment, their own earnings, you know, are not halal. I remember, for example, a mosque project asking for donations because they had to pay for the mosque or they would not be able to hold on to the building, and they didn't have the money, so they had to borrow money on interest. Interest is haram, please help us. This is not how you build a mosque. The mosque built on sound foundations is the one that we should pray in. And so, because we want to do things big, we want the big mosque, we don't even have the big community to support it, we suddenly take on debt, and then we build the mosque on borrowed money, and then we stuck, and then we ask everybody to bail us out when they themselves can't help their own families because they're also in debt. And this is not the way you solve the problem. So sometimes aiming for the stars is not what we should be doing, but down to earth, looking at the little few things that we can control. When we try to make a difference, we also got to try to understand how best to change, to reform, to improve. For example, Allah tells us in the Quran, it's getting a bit windy here, that you should call to the way of your Lord, so you should call to Islam with wisdom and nice admonition. Even Musa alayhi salam and Harun were told to talk gentle to the Pharaoh, the big tyrant, in case he might be inclined to listen to the guidance. Our task is not to compel people to accept the message. So many times Allah tells the Prophet ﷺ that you can't make people believe. You can't guide whom you love. Allah guides whom He wants. You can't force people to accept the message. This is in Allah's hand. But you can gently guide them to see the value, the benefit of the message. And they should see the benefit of it before you tell them their obligations. Because people are always more inclined to go for something that they think is beneficial rather than something that is asked of them. Hence, when we try to do dawah to people, we ought to be of service to them. We Muslims should not have this insular mentality that we are a special group, we are the chosen people. Just like the Jews said they are the chosen people and then became arrogant about it and Allah rejected them finally. We should not follow in that same pattern and say we are the chosen people and they owe us and we have any entitlement upon them, they only disbelieve us, it doesn't matter what we do with them and who cares, and they're subservient to us. It doesn't work like that. We want special privileges for ourselves, we want our Muslim rights. We should be more concerned about what we can provide, what we can give, what way out we can show people of their dilemma, because we have the guidance. We know about alternatives to interest-based finance. We know about alternatives to immorality and that total confusion about who is related to who nowadays. We know about alternatives to crime. We have strict rules on narcotics. We are able to show people a better way. And that's what we need to do. We need not to think of ourselves first. We are actually quite happy to sacrifice in order to guide others. The early Muslims spent 3 years outcast from Mecca in a valley, so destitute that they had no food and were chewing on their leather belts just to get rid of the pangs of hunger. Are we willing to make that sort of sacrifice in order to allow the message to reach other people and see that we are happy to go to any lengths in order to make their life easier rather than ask them to go to any lengths to make our lives easier? We have struck that balance completely wrong, because if you look at it, we had Muslims in the West for now a good century. Some sizable presence of Muslims, including the availability of materials in, let's say, the English language, sound materials about Islam. We've had this for at least a century. Yet, there has been no shift of those countries wanting to embrace Islam. To the contrary, the example of the Muslim puts them off. Why? The early Muslims, when they went to any country, their example was such that everybody wanted to join them. Numerous countries became Muslim not by conquest, but by seeing the example of Muslim traders or people who had moved there and found it so attractive that they wanted to be part of it. Now Islam is so unattractive because we're so proud. You know, we make a fuss about the face veil. We make a fuss about wearing the thobe. And we're so proud because if you had to work the field, you wouldn't do it in a thobe. If you had to run for your life, you wouldn't do it in the thobe. So we have become the sort of elite that looks down on the people who do manual labor because we're above that. The niqab was an invention of the Byzantines. The Romans, because in the Roman ideology, the woman was evil. She tempts man. She has to cover her face so he doesn't look on her. That is not Islamic. But then the Muslims, when they conquered Byzantine, when they conquered Istanbul, when that became part of their realm, they saw these Christian ladies wearing that dress. And who wore the dress? Only the upper class ladies who could afford to be pious, because those who were working the fields couldn't. So it became a status symbol. So many of the Muslim ladies adopted it, saying, well, yeah, we want to be upper class. If that's upper class fashion, we want to wear upper class fashion. Now everybody wants to dress like a rich Gulf Arab, because that's upper class, that's rich. But that's not necessarily Islam. It's all right for the Gulf Arabs to dress like that because that's how they have dressed for many years. But why imitate them just because they got money? If they were poor Bedouins still, we wouldn't imitate them, would we now? We dream of lush palaces. We don't copy the dress code of, let's say, the Muslims in Eritrea or Ethiopia or the Sudan. They don't have that status in our minds. So we actually completely out of balance with our focus, with our perception, with our ambitions. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said that works are by intention. And again, we have to get that balance right, because essentially, if the intention isn't right, all that follows isn't right. But then we have the English saying that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. If you just have intentions and don't act upon them, that's no good either. You can dream, but dreaming does not change the world. Therefore, in the Quran, we constantly told about those who believe and do good works. Salihat, same as the Islah. The good works are those works that make things better, that create Islah, that restore the balance. So what Shu'aib says there is, I want to do as many good works as I possibly can. That's all he wants to do. And that's all we need to want to do. We should have that intention to do the best we can. Knowing well that perfection is not within our reach. Perfection belongs to Allah. Success belongs to Allah. Whether our work succeeds or not is up to Allah. But whether we try or not is up to us. So ultimately, we have to strike the right balance between what we want to do and what we know we can do. For example, there is no point saying that I will not teach anybody until I've learned all that there is to learn in Islam. Firstly, you won't ever manage. And secondly, nobody will benefit from that knowledge once you've learned it, because by the time you're there, you can't teach anybody. So teaching and learning go hand in hand. Whilst we teach, we learn. And sometimes you learn most from teaching, because when you teach, you discover your own weaknesses and where you're not quite sure yet and where you need to look something up when students have questions and so on. And whilst we learn, we gain the confidence to pass it on and share it and teach. There is a balance. And there is also a process that we go through life. You know, there is no point the younger generation wanting to teach the older generation how to live, because they haven't got a clue what it means to get through life. Very often we have, and especially since we now in Muslim families also have this generation conflict, we have this arrogance of the youth as if they know everything better. They don't know much yet, but they know everything better. In order to make that judgment, you have to have been there. Until you experience the situation, you can't judge whether somebody dealt with it appropriately or not. Until you've been in somebody's shoes, you don't know what it's like to be in that situation, and you can't judge that situation. In fact, we shouldn't judge at all. We should judge ourselves regularly and say, have I been up to the task? Could I do better? Yeah, that nafsul lawama, the one that constantly, the soul that constantly challenges itself to do better. The reflective mode. Thinking, well, yeah, I did all right there, but I could improve here. We should not judge others because we don't know why they did what. That lesson is clearly told to us in the story of Musa alayhi salam and Al-Khidr, whom Allah had given knowledge of a kind that Musa alayhi salam couldn't understand, and that Khidr told him even, you cannot understand, you cannot follow that which you have no knowledge of. There are things in the world that we don't understand because we have no experience of it. And because of that, we are not qualified to judge these matters. We need to be humble enough to deal with that which we can deal with. Again, strike a balance. And Allah has made life in stages and a sequence we go through from childhood through youth. First we just copy and learn, then we think and learn independently, then we start applying it, then we reach out for wider horizons. But the first decades of our life is to observe, learn, and practice. And only then, when we have kind of developed into a level of maturity, which Allah puts at 40 years. He says about the one who, when he's 40 years, says that he thanks Allah and his parents for how they have brought him up and so on. Yes, 40 years. It is only then, when you have that sort of maturity, that you become an authority in your field. And then you become extremely active, to the point that many people have burnout and overload because everything is on their shoulders, and we haven't learned to share either. We take on too much very often. You know, the work-life balance, we talked about the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who had the perfect balance between family matters, matters of the state, spending time with his companions, looking after the poor, the weak. It is not easy at all to balance all those different aspects of one's life. Just to balance work and Islamic dawah and home life, just those three are difficult. But these are the active years where we try our best to do as much as we can, to improve things, to make things better as much as we can, to create for our children a better future than we had ourselves. This is the aim of every parent. And then gradually you start retiring from that active phase. Partly because your health doesn't allow you anymore to run the marathon. Partly because you are not as fast and quick anymore. You are not that sharp anymore at the job, and you let some other people take that role. We must learn when to step aside, give up, and let others take over. Another thing we Muslims are very bad at. Most Muslim leaders cling to power until death strikes them. We don't delegate. We don't pass on the baton very well. And also, we need to not forget that there is a place for the advanced generation who have kind of semi-retired from the active duty, but have a lot of experience when they did actively fight for the cause, and therefore can guide the next generation and can share that information, can share their experiences. And to reject that wealth of knowledge and experience that culminates in wisdom is a folly. Because these are the stages. We start with knowledge. Knowledge is theoretical. We learn something, but we really don't know exactly what it means until we put it into practice. We apply it, applied knowledge, action through experience. With experience, we find out how to use knowledge and what works. And only with knowledge and experience combined can we try to reach a stage of wisdom. Wisdom meaning you can make the right judgments. Hikmah being related to hukm. Wisdom is something you cannot learn from books. Wisdom is something you cannot actually learn at all. It is a gift Allah gives you based on having tried to put your knowledge into practice. Because Allah says that He gives wisdom to whom He wishes, and whoever has been given wisdom has been given a great deal of good. The ability, like Solomon alayhi salam, Sulaiman alayhi salam, the ability to understand situations and come up with the right solution, with the right judgment. It is not an easy one. And for that reason, the judge gets a reward even if he reaches the wrong conclusion, provided he's made every effort to get it right. Because sometimes people lie, sometimes people cheat, sometimes people try and sway him in a certain direction and he doesn't realize. But sound judgment is based on wisdom, and wisdom is only something that Allah gives to people who have tried their best to learn and act upon it. Iman and good works. Everything in life has its balance. Spend time alone and spend time with people. The vigor of the young and the wisdom of the old. There is a time for this and there is a time for that. The strengthening of our own community and the guidance of those outside our community. This concept of the balance is one of the key concepts of Islam. That if we understand it, if we hold on to it, if we try to apply it, we can't go astray. We can't fall for extremist ideologies. It's not possible. Any Muslim who is grounded and understands the concept of balance, it is impossible for that Muslim to consider extremism as an option. Immediately when it appears, he knows that is not part of our way. That is not part of the teachings of the Quran. That is not part of the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And therefore that is not part of Islam. It doesn't matter at all how much these people put on the label of Islam, raise the banner of Islam, pretend to be Muslims. And we got to understand that Islam is very powerful. Even so now, as Muslims, we probably feel we are weak and oppressed. Islam is very powerful. It is liberating. It is a belief, a practice that cannot ultimately be conquered simply because Allah says He will protect this way. He's chosen this way. Religion with Allah is Islam. Nothing else will be accepted. Islam, of course, being submission to that which Allah wants us to do. Islam is extremely powerful, and therefore, those who don't want to lose their unjustified privilege and want to hold on to their illicit gain and want to keep profiteering from war and drugs and immorality and gambling and prostitution, those people, when they realize that they have nothing, they can fight Islam openly, their argument is weak. The plot of the devil is weak, Allah says. They will try to divert the Muslims instead and use subversion. I have shown this through how this has been attempted through history. Just like with the doctrine of Paul, the Romans gained the upper hand over Christianity and subverted Christianity into becoming again like their old paganism, including their old pagan festivals at the various sun solstices, Easter and Christmas. And it would be totally imperceivable that they didn't try it also with Islam. I've already talked about the commercialization of Islam. The subversion of Islam has also been attempted in order to try to make Islam weak. And what better that if you can't fight a Muslim because his face is too strong, you can mislead him by pretending that you are a better Muslim than him. Yeah, this is the ISIS scenario. And some will fall for it. You can be more righteous than the righteous. And you can pretend it's in the name of Islam, and really it's subservient to the enemies of Islam. I've shown this in a book called Surrendering Islam. So the historic example is there. It would be a folly of us to think that they didn't try to do that. And we've got to be cautious. Sometimes we shouldn't be too quick to follow any sort of good speaker, demagogue, or grand movement. We should look at two things: who finances it and who benefits. If ISIS mostly kills Muslims, it's not the Muslims who benefit. Therefore, it's not a Muslim agenda. It's a non-Muslim agenda. You always look who benefits, and also who is behind it financially, who provides the equipment, the resources, and so on. But the question who benefits is a key question in figuring out, is this good or bad? If Muslims and humanity benefit, then it's good. If they don't, it doesn't matter how halal and Islamic you call it, it is not good. Back then we showed it in another book because everybody got so worked up about Salman Rushdie and the satanic verses, and we wrote the book Satanic Voices, which I published to show that actually this is a plot in order to make Muslims look outraged and divert them. And it was a way of creating the climate that later allowed things like the Iraq War to happen, that allowed Bosnia to happen, that allowed later Syria to happen. They work long term, not like us who always just respond to what is thrown at us. They have a strategic plan. We've lost that ability. Yusuf alayhi salam planned 15 years. 7 years you store, 7 years you use, and then after that you return to normal. 15 years. Who of us plans 15 years? We don't plan the next day. We can't agree on anything. But they do. Those who don't want Islam to succeed, they plan these moves. And we just react and respond and fall into the trap. We've lost that balance. Of course, things don't always go to plan, but you have to plan and you have to be able to adjust it as well. And you have to pass on the knowledge from generation to generation. Otherwise, everybody starts afresh. This is the problem. If now you study how this one world dominion enterprise of the Dajjal has been engineered, the monopoly one world government that they're striving for, with its seat in Jerusalem, with the International Court of Justice, which will be no justice, but that's how they call it, where they want to disarm everybody because they quote from the Bible that you shall turn your weapons into plowshares. When you look how this project has been developed over not just years, decades, but centuries, and given that there is so much misinformation and an overload of information that is very difficult for anybody to look through it without guidance, you end up that somebody can spend their whole life finding out what they were doing, and thereafter it's too late for them to do anything. So unless we pass things on from one to the other, all that learning is pointless. Like I said earlier, you can learn all your life and then nobody benefits. There were presidents who, whilst in office, thought they could make a difference, and then in their memoirs wrote that it didn't work. It didn't occur to them at the time that the system just uses you without you being able to achieve what you wanted to achieve. If this is the case for the top man, of course, behind the scenes, other people run the show, then what about us? So we must be careful not to be caught up in systems that we don't fully understand. We must be careful and we must try to understand and share that understanding. That is the only way forward. The revival of Islam, the revival of the Islamic nation, and that is not a nation state, that is the Ummah. The concept of Ummah, we haven't talked about it much, but the concept of Ummah is very different from the concept of a state or a nation state. The revival of the Ummah is not achieved through politics or even armed conflict. It is achieved through education, tarbiyah, through refining our own Islam and character, bonding with each other, learning to work together, and thereby setting an example that reaches the hearts not just of the Muslims but also the non-Muslims, and becomes attractive enough for people in masses to want to be part of it. As Allah says, when the victory of Allah comes, you will see people enter the religion in masses, because everybody wants to join a winning cause. As long as we portray Islam as a losing cause, as a minority cause, as a lost cause, people say, I don't want to be part of that. Understandably, everybody wants to join the winner. So we need to turn it round and present Islam as a successful cause, a winning cause, and of course not just present it. So it is true that we have the best product and the worst salesman, but also demonstrate it. The best sales tactic for a product is to demonstrate that it works. Let people try it, and if they think, oh yeah, that's really good, and then effectively they say, I want one. So we need to create opportunities for people around us to see Islam in action. Again, it's all about the balance. That concept is one of the foundations before we delve into tafsir and hadith and fiqh, and how do you do this and how do you do that, and are there 21 rules or 22 to observe? We get so caught up in these things. We need to get those concepts, those principles right. Inshallah, at a later date, if this series proves to be beneficial, I might do another set of talks going into more detail on specific topics, but I pray and hope that this look at Islam from a conceptual perspective, from a different viewpoint, this look at Islam and what Islam means to us and our place within it and within the world maybe helps for us to get some reorientation and guidance so that we can be more effective as Muslims. Alhamdulillah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.